Welcome to the world of Reach. The Road to War, Part 2. The group was clustered around the long table in the middle of the operations center. 2 rows of workstations lined either side of the table with doors on either end. The workstations were empty. Vice President DeWall and Facility 12 Administrator Hellman stared down at the table, lit up with a 2D model of the mine. Moving closer, Lee saw the little dots that represented each of the miners at the bottom of the shaft. Unless he did something, those dots would wink out soon. Or the dots that replaced them at the start of the next shift. Karen Corp wanted their mine working, or people would die. How could he stop it from happening? As chief engineer, he could shut the factory down, but if he did, DeWall could replace him overnight. If people kept working the mines, sooner or later those dots on the screen would read as lifeless as the Reach soil. More lifeless. The terraforming was taking hold. There was algae, lichen, even scrub brush in some parts of the planet. So, Lee asked himself, how do you stop it? If he said no to whatever VP DeWall suggested, his career, maybe his life, would be a radioactive cinder. 2 more years, and he'd be out of here. 2 more years, and he'd own his life free and clear, and no one could ever claim him or his children in indentured servitude again. It was impossible. He was an engineer. He'd do the impossible. Lee walked around the table to stand between Hellman and VP DeWall. DeWall tapped his fingers on the table, flipping through a series of outlines for each level of the mine shaft until a set of icons representing heat signatures, biometric readouts, and motion sensors depicted what was happening at the very bottom of the shaft. Green light flashed over shafts 2 through 5, while yellow and red outlined shaft 1. The location of the explosion that had killed 2 and injured almost every other person in the day shift. Lee and his team had worked frantically to get the day ship up safely without any more loss of life. And then Hellman had sent the night shift right back down again. Lee had been in ops, madly reviewing scans of the mines to find out what had gone so terribly wrong when the central and backup elevator shafts had both winked offline. He could not grasp how both elevators had failed, until someone had passed him a handheld, and Carmen Morales was on the other end of the line, calling up from the pit. She was more than ready to explain it to him. Lee couldn't fault her for calling the work stoppage. The shift chief had signed her own pink slip with the action. Likely everyone working under her down there would find themselves unemployed, and soon, but Carmen was making the gutsy call, the right call. She'd spent her first half hour down the hole, every last minute of discretionary time the corporation allowed a crew chief in the mines to scan and collate data about the explosion. She'd sent that data onto Lee, who double-checked it and verified what Carmen had seen. Similar gas pockets to the one that had taken Shaft 1 offline extended below Shafts 2 and 3. There was every chance the pockets extended below the other shafts, too. How 30 years of passive scans and drilling had missed the pockets wasn't the issue. The issue was, what was Karen Corp going to do about it now they knew it was there? DeWall tapped the screen with both index fingers and chipmunked his cheeks with a deep breath that he slowly let out. The gas pockets all scan only a few dozen meters deep? That's the good news, Lee said, leaning over the table. At almost 6 feet, Lee was tall for a native reacher. He ignored VP DeWall's cocked eyebrow as he reached almost clear across the table to pull up one of the last tests he'd performed. He dragged the icon for the file all the way across and dropped it on a blank part of the display right in front of the VP. These anomalous gas pockets were formed millennia ago when the planet cooled. An incredible and total fluke. But we've compared these new guides and the original surveys. Lee tapped some red dots on the screen. There's this dozen meters of uncharted surprise below the current tunnel floor, then I can guarantee solid rock on down. The mine is still viable. We just have to take operations offline, detonate each pocket, and erect new support pillars for the shafts. A day to erect the pillars, using wave-guided crystal scaffolding, a few days of detonations tops, then a week, 10 days of excavation tops. then back to business as usual." Lee's lips twitched despite the seriousness of the moment. The speed and precision of the latest generation of crystalline steel lattice generating tech was so much more precise, and he was eager to get a chance to play with it. Doubly so if it could save more miners' lives. "He's one of my best men," Hellman assured DeWall. "I trust his findings with my stock options." DeWall chuckled sourly, not looking up from the map. "You're trusting him with far more than that." He looked back down and growled again at the display Lee had shown him. "The cost to evacuate the gas isn't the problem," DeWall muttered. "The time required is." One of his skinny fingers flicked through Lee's findings. "The gas pockets are only a threat to half the tunnels. The rest we can mine at full capacity, and they may never explode. We'll keep them running while we excavate the other shafts and deal with the gas." Lee went cold. "Our data set is incomplete. We've had a blind spot on the maps we never knew about, and people have died because of it. We can't be sure there's not a gas pocket a foot below the surface in every one of those tunnels." "Or those tunnels could be solid as ever." DeWall shook his head. "We can afford to lose a few miners. We can't afford to miss our contract deadline." "Offer them 300% danger pay," he snickered. "I've seen those rats fight each other over who'd buy it first to get the survivor's benefit." Lee stared at Hellman. He couldn't believe his ears. He knew the administrator was a prick, but this was murder. "I can't authorize any further mining, sir," Lee said, the words tumbling out of his mouth before he'd consciously decided to take a stand. "I won't sign off on a return to operational status until repairs are complete." DeWall straightened. "Administrator, get your colony birth under control." Lee glared at the VP. The VP glared back, wearing his loathsome Earther privilege proudly. Lee didn't look away. "If you go through with this, I'll report you to Gov for criminal negligence." DeWall laughed. "You report us? To the Gov that just demanded we increase our quota? Earth is hungry for what Reach sends them. They don't give a damn who dies to get them their supply." Let me speak to him, sir." Hellman almost touched DeWall's arm, then backed off, head bowed. "He'll sign off, Vice President." "He'd better!" DeWall's bulging eyes fixed Lee with a venomous look. "Karen Corp didn't only receive a quota increase, Engineer Zhang." The way DeWall smiled at him set Lee's guts churning again. "Gov upgraded this facility and our quota to protected priority. If we don't start mining today, I can declare Facility 12 under martial law. Under martial law, this work stoppage becomes an act of treason." DeWall stood straighter, clasping his hands behind his back. "Do you know what I will be required to do to those dirty little diggers under martial law, Zhang?" Lee wasn't fooled by DeWall's straightening posture and serious face. The man was excited by the prospect of what he would be required to do. "He'll kill them all." DeWall relaxed his posture, adopting a perfect facsimile of a reasonable, concerned expression. "Earth has 6 sons and daughters," the VP said, "but Reach is the only son talking to us right now." As soon as he trotted out the tired excuse corporations had used since the first colony had gone dark, Lee gritted his teeth so hard his jaw cracked. Now he knew there was nothing he could say that would change the VP's mind. Sure enough, the false fatherly advice was followed up by a threat. DeWall tapped Lee's shoulder. "So be a good son, and choose your next words carefully, Zhang. You're only a demotion away from working the mine yourself." He wished this wasn't happening, that he was sitting with Maggie holding hands between the rocking chairs in front of their farmhouse hab module and staring at another patch of Reach foothills. Something squirmed in his guts. If he were back there, would he tell Maggie about this? Would she look at him the same way when she found out he'd taken no for an answer? When he stood by and did nothing, knowing people would be injured or killed? At least his protestations had led to a danger pay order. And DeWall was right. Zhang had seen miners viciously battle each other for a big payout. Yes, even when cashing in could kill them. But he'd never been the one sending them to their deaths before. Can I take a minute to process this, Mr. Vice President?" DeWall sneered at Lee as if he'd just called his bluff at poker. He waved him away. "Take your minute, then. Do as you're told." Lee nodded, feeling numb, and walked past the group to the access door on the far side of the table. DeWall turned to Hellman. "If they don't come up before end of shift, we turn off the O2 and drag their bodies out. I want the mine ready for the day shift." Lee closed his eyes and stumbled forward to the door. It tugged open with a hiss, and he put his shoulder into it on the far side to shove it quickly shut again. Cut the O2? As above, so below. Cut the oxygen to the mine, and people would die just as surely as if VP DeWall had tossed them out of the surface without air tanks. The air inside the long warehouse on the other side of the door carried an earthy scent, but damp, a rarity on reach, and mixed with a metallic tang from the pipes feeding down into the mine. The hum of the scrubbers a level below vibrated through Lee's shoes. He folded his hands over the back of his neck and squeezed his eyes shut. He'd come here to calm down since his first shift in the mines before the scholarship sent him on a different path. Calm wasn't coming. He couldn't stop what was coming. It's not like he had any power. If he did not obey DeWall, the VP would have him replaced, and have him thrown down the mine with the day shift, most likely now. What good would throwing his life away do? He laughed, a choking sound. He gusted out a long breath and let his hands fall to his sides, accepting the good it would do. It would keep blood off his hands. It would let him sleep after the inevitable. No qualifications and no excuses, he told himself. It's wrong, he whispered. Saying the words out loud, committing himself, made everything that came next easier. By the time he'd loaded the cart with a selection of supplies running against the wall of the warehouse, he was smiling. Sorry, kids, he said, his voice stronger, determined, as he hauled the cart back to the operations center. Ah, it's our friend the chief engineer, DeWall taunted, turning from the table towards the opening door. Glad to have you back on the clock. Start spinning down the ventilation system. The skinny man with the bulging eyes leaned against the table and waited. Lee didn't answer, except to pull a long, narrow box with yellow arrows all around it off his cart and place it on the floor. Arrow side faced out towards the warehouse. He stood and kicked the safety plating on the back of the unit. Chief Zong? Administrator Hellman asked. Lee ignored him, too, and kicked away the safety plate. Beneath the plate were 3 wide buttons. He nudged each button with his foot and each lit up, first yellow, then orange, and finally a blinking red. He nodded, satisfied, and walked back to the cart. VP DeWall's grin faded as Lee trundled past him. Administrator Hellman stepped into his path. Just what do you think? He began. Then he bleated with surprise and stumbled back up against the table so as not to lose his kneecaps to the cart. Lee was halfway across the room before DeWall found his voice. Insubordination! He shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Lee's bag. Dereliction! Lee continued on, humming a half-remembered mining song about boots, dust, and blood as he propped open the door leading out to the green and set up the second box. One of the security guards crossed over to examine the first case Lee had set up. Sir, there's a danger label on it. Lee raised his handheld over his head. You'll want to back up, he called over his shoulder to the guard. He kicked the second box's safety plate free and again nudged 3 buttons inside. When he turned, he saw he had the room's undivided attention. Blinking lights and danger labels had that effect. He chuckled, enjoying his moment of insubordination and dereliction, and being careful not to think about what was sure to follow. He'd made his choice. He tapped the screen of his handheld. Back up, he warned again. Despite the insanity and finality of his chosen course of action, Lee felt good. He was enjoying himself. Administrator Hellman and the VP's assistants elbowed past each other up the short flights of stairs. The guards swooped into action, pushing VP DeWall up to the second row of workstations. One of them landed on top of his very important personage. Should be far enough, Lee said. He turned his head over his shoulder, out toward the green, to face the stretchers of injured miners. He tapped his handheld a second time. Blue light and a thunderclap overrode his senses. The shockwave threw him into the air. He hit the ground and rolled into the blinking lights of the second explosive device. Coughing, blinded by a whirlwind wave of dust and debris, Lee let out a wordless scream. Had he underestimated the force of the blast? He stood, peering through smoke and dust. Creaks and groans from the operations center began to filter back into his ears. Light fixtures swung from the ceiling, held in place just by their wiring, and nothing moved. The dust fell quickly in reaches slightly higher than Earth-normal gravity, but it was a few more seconds before he could see through it to the far side. "He's okay. The VP's okay," one of the bodyguards coughed to the other. "Check the rest." One uniformed guard stumbled from the gloom, a pistol in one hand and the other holding up one of the VP's assistants. Lee sagged with relief. Nobody seriously injured. Hearing loss, maybe. Possibly soiled underwear and lost dignity, but that was it. Well, that and his career. The guard caught sight of him and shouted to his partner, raising his gun. Lee calmly held his finger above the handheld and shook his head. The bodyguard's eyes widened, tracking from Lee back down to the second box. The bodyguard's eyes never left his again, but lowered the muzzle of his sidearm, which seemed the size of a cannon to Lee, down to the floor, halfway between the two men. "Drop it," called the other bodyguard. Lee saw him in his peripheral vision, walking toward him behind the top row of workstations. He shook his head. "Take a look." He nodded at the far doorway. The operations center's back wall was destroyed. The metal buckled in some places, outright shredded in others by a deep blue rippling wall of crystal. It looked like a deep blue glacier had appeared in an instant. The other bodyguard looked back and froze, mouth open. Lee had made the same face the first time he'd seen a shelter bomb go off. A crystal scaffold had saved his life during a cave-in in his first year as a miner. It really was a bomb, but the explosion was channeled into erecting a crystalline steel matrix to reinforce weakening tunnel walls in the caves. It had been that experience that ignited his passion for engineering. He had come full circle, saving more lives just as he ended his career. Now if he could only get out of here without getting killed in the bargain. Skin flushed, only half believing this was happening, Lee took advantage of the second bodyguard's distraction and stepped backwards over the box. Just crossing the barrier made him bolder. "Duck and cover, friend," he warned. The wolfish smile returned to his lips. They ran. The instant their backs were turned, Lee ran too, following the wall of the op center. He tapped the screen and screamed right along with the roar of the explosion. You have been listening to Reach, The Road to War. Written and narrated by John Miro. Music, All This by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Hear more of the story at servingworlds.com. Thank you for listening.